Your hands together for Brett Weinstein, Sam Harris, and Jordan Peterson.
Thank you. Hello, Vancouver. Thank you.
Hello. All right, so we have an interesting situation here. Obviously, this is part two, and a few of you were here for what took place last night. We are going to find a way to catch you all up pretty quick on what took place. But before we do that, I thought it might make sense to talk to you about where we are in this discussion and why it matters. And it matters not just for those of us on stage, but it matters very much for you all in the audience. The point is basically this. We've arrived at a place in history where the sense-making apparatus that usually helps us figure out what to think about things has obviously begun to come apart. The political parties, the universities, journalism, all of these things have stopped making sense. And alternative sense-making networks have begun to rise, and the one that we end up being a part of seems to be beating the odds with respect to staying alive and being a vibrant part of the conversation. But that depends on something. It depends on our ability to upgrade what we can discuss and navigate. And Sam and Jordan have run afoul of each other in the past, as you all know, and so our ability to upgrade the conversation such that they're able to find common ground and for us to move forward together is potentially a very important upgrade. Now, that upgrade in the modern era includes you all, because our conversation and your conversations are all now linked through the internet. So, the ground rules for tonight involve you not filming what takes place on stage tonight. And the reason for that is because what takes place on stage tonight has consequences, and the freer that Sam and Jordan feel to use new tools to try out positions that maybe they haven't explored before, the more likely we are to succeed. So please don't film. But that does not mean that we don't want you talking about what was discussed here tonight. In fact, we're very excited to see what you all make of this conversation and where it heads. So in an effort to get you up to speed on where we got yesterday, and I think the evidence is strong, we all felt, and the discussion online suggests that we actually accomplished quite a bit yesterday, that we made headway. In an effort to attempt to keep that momentum going, what we are going to do is we are going to have Sam and Jordan steelman each other's points from last night so that you can hear what that sounds like. Now, for those of you who have ever tried steelmanning somebody's point with whom you have a severe disagreement, you know just how hard this is. So let's give them some leeway. Sam, would you be willing to start?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, first, let me just make the obvious point that probably isn't so obvious unless you take the time to put yourself in our shoes, but just imagine how surreal it is for us to be who we are, simply having a conversation about ideas, and to be able to put a date on the calendar and have all of you show up for this. I mean, it's just an amazing privilege. Thank you for coming out. So here is what I think Jordan thinks I'm getting wrong. I think that was grammatically correct. Maybe there's another note in there, but clearly I don't understand how valuable stories are, how deep they go, the degree to which stories encode not only the wisdom of our ancestors, but quite possibly the wisdom born of the hard knocks of evolution of the species, right? So there's no telling how deep the significance of the information encoded in stories goes. And there's a class of stories that are religious stories, and they're religious for a reason, because they're dealing with the deepest questions in human life. They're questions about what constitutes a good life, what's worth living for, what's worth dying for. These are things that if each individual just thrust onto the stage of his own life, not knowing where he is, and tasked with figuring out how to live all on his own, or even in a collection of others who are similarly unguided by ancient wisdom, this is not knowledge we can recapitulate for ourselves easily. And so we edit or ignore these ancient stories at our peril, at minimum at some considerable risk, because we don't know how much, we don't really know what baby is in the bathwater. And so we should have immense respect for these traditions. And this is as yet to be discovered tonight. I'm still not quite clear about how this links up with more metaphysical propositions about the origins of certain of these stories. But at minimum, my criticism of religion, because it tends to focus on the most obvious case of a zero-sum contest between religious dogmatism and scientific open-ended discussion, doesn't address this core issue of the significance of religious thinking and religious narrative, because I am, for the most part, just shooting fish in a barrel, criticizing fundamentalists, and the kind of God that the fundamentalists believe in, the God who's an invisible person who hates homosexuals, obviously that's not the deepest version of these religious, this essentially what is a narrative technology for orienting human life in the cosmos. So maybe I'll leave it there, but that's, I think, what Jordan thinks.
All right, Jordan, before you steel man Sam's point, how did you feel about his encapsulation of yours?
Well, I'm convinced, man.
Yeah.
No, look, I mean, well, I got a couple of things to say about it. It's like, first of all, I think it was accurate, concise, fair. I also think that, this is a more technical note in some sense, is that if you ever want to think about something, that's exactly what you have to do, right? You want to take arguments that are against your perspective, and you want to make them as strong as you possibly can so that you can fortify your arguments against them. You don't want to make them weak, because that just makes you weak. And so, Sam and I are both scientists, and it really is the case that what scientists are trying to do, and I think what we're actually trying to do in this conversation genuinely, is to try to find out if there's something that we're thinking that's stupid. Because when I'm laying out the arguments that Sam just summarized so well, I've tried to generate a bunch of opposition to them in my own imagination, and the arguments I put forward are ones I can't undermine. But that doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean that at all. And so if someone comes along and this is certainly the case if you're a scientist who's worth his or her salt, if someone comes along and says, hey, look, you made a mistake in this fundamental proposition, it's like, yes, great, that means I can make progress towards a more solid theory of being. So, and that's what we're trying to do, and I do think it's working, and so I thought that was just fine, exactly dead on, and I hope I can do justice to your position as well. So, okay, so I'm going to summarize Sam's argument briefly, and then I'm going to tell him, let you guys know why he thinks what things I'm not taking into account. So, Sam believes that there are two fundamental dangers to psychological and social stability. Religious fundamentalism, essentially on the right, and moral relativism and nihilism on the left. And so the danger of the right-wing position is that it enables people to arbitrarily establish certain revealed axioms as indisputable truth, and then to tyrannize themselves and other people with the claims that those are divine revelations. And he sees that as part of the danger of religious fundamentalism, and maybe religious thinking in general, but also as something that characterizes secular totalitarian states that also has a religious aspect. So that's on the right. And then on the left, well, the problem with the moral relativism nihilism position is that it leaves us with no orientation. And it also flies in the face of common sense observations that there are ways to live that are bad and that there are ways to live that are good that people can generally agree on, and that statements about those general agreements about how to live can be considered factual. Now, and then the next part of Sam's argument is that we require a value system that allows us to escape these twin dangers. One stultifies us and the other leaves us hopeless, let's say. And that value system has to be grounded in something real. And the only thing that he can see that actually constitutes real in any provable sense, and there's a certain amount of historical and conceptual weight behind this claim, is the domain of empirical facts as they've been manifested in the sciences and technologies that have made us incredibly powerful and increasingly able to flourish in the world. And so we need to ground our value propositions in something that we've been able to determine has genuine solidity so that we can orient ourselves properly, so that we can make moral claims and that we can avoid these twin dangers. We can begin with some basic facts that we can identify, as I mentioned briefly, what constitutes a bad life: endless pain, suffering, anxiety, tremendous amount of negative emotion, short-term lifespan, all the things that no one would choose voluntarily for themselves if we would all agree that they were thinking in a healthy manner. And we can contrast that sort of domain of horror with the good life, which might involve, well, certainly freedom from privation and want and undue threat and anxiety and hope for the future and all of that, and that we can agree that those are poles, good, bad, and good, and that that's a factual claim. So Sam also claims that we can define the good life, this is an extension of it, with reference to flourishing and well-being, and that can actually be measured, and that we should and can inform the idea of flourishing and well-being with empirical data. Having said all that, he also leaves a domain of inquiry open that would be centered on the possibility that some of the ideas that have been encapsulated in religious phenomenology, if not in religious dogma, might be worth pursuing as well, that there might be wisdom that could practically be applied in terms of perception to spiritual practices, although those become increasingly dangerous as they become ensconced in dogma. And so that's Sam's position. And then his criticism of my ideas, he would say that it's facts, not stories, that constitute the ground for the proper science of well-being, and that we don't need to be connected to stories, ancient stories in particular, to thrive. And the reason for that are that these ancient stories are pathological in certain details, especially in the specific claims they make, which look outrageous in some sense from a modern moral perspective. And he believes that it's hand-waving to ignore those specific topics with a what would you call it, an optimistic overview of the entire context. That they're dangerously outdated now, if they ever were useful. That they're subject to too many potential interpretations for any modern usage to be reliably derived. And so he believes that attempts to interpret these stories, let's say, are rife with so many potential errors of bias and interpretation and subjectivity that all the interpretations in some sense are unreliable, and perhaps equally unreliable. That worse than that, not only are they unreliable, but they're dangerous insofar as the claims they lay out pose a threat to scientific and Enlightenment values, which are the true saviors of humanity, as evidenced by our progress, let's say, over the last 200 or 300 years, and that they're also susceptible to the totalitarian interpretation, which I described earlier, which confer upon the interpreter a sense of and then a claim to revealed truth. And so I would say that's Sam's argument and his criticisms of my position. So,
okay, so you write my next book. I'll write yours.
So, Sam, how do you feel about that characterization of your position?
Certainly close enough to get the conversation started. I mean, there's the grounding stuff we have yet to talk about, and I'm not as much a stickler for materialistic scientific empiricism as I heard implied there, but we can come to that.
So hold on.
Yep.
I think from the point of view of the audience, this is a good barometer of where we got to last night, and I think actually the gains are really impressive, which I have to say is spooking me because of something called regression to the mean. Now, if I catch either one of you regressing to the mean tonight, I will hunt you down and I will ridicule you on Twitter tomorrow. So you have been warned.
Okay.
All right, so do either one of you want to now talk about what was missing from the other characterization, or how do you want to move?
I think we should touch this issue of metaphorical truth, because I think it still gets at the distance between us.
Sure.
Yep.
And happily, this is your phrase that you have. I mean, you might want to. Do you want to prop up this phrase?
Why not?
Yeah.
So the idea of metaphorical truth, which I think actually is the reconciliation between at least the points that you guys each started out with, is the idea that there are concepts which are literally false, that we can falsify in a scientific, rational sense, but that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you were if you behave according to the fact that they are false. And so to call these things simply false is an error. In effect, the universe has left them true in some sense other than a purely literal one. And so religions would then, according to actually what you heard from both Sam and Jordan, religions would fall into this class of things. These are encapsulations of stories and prescriptions that if you follow them, irrespective of whether they literally describe the universe, you end up with certain advantages that you may not know why they are there, but nonetheless you are ahead of your you're ahead of your position if you were to navigate just simply on your perceptions. So
Right.
that's the concept.
Yeah, so I think there's a good analogy that you and I stumbled onto after we did a podcast together. You had an analogy about a porcupine that could shoot its quills, which many people balked at, but a listener gave us a better one, which was the idea that anyone who's worked with guns at all must have heard this admonishment to treat every gun as if it is loaded, right? And you actually, last night when I alleged that you believed in God, you corrected me. You said, no, you live as if God exists, right? And so this seems like there's a connection here. So if I had a gun here that I wanted to show Brett, if I know anything about guns, I'm going to make damn sure that it's unloaded, right? I'm going to pull back the slide, I'm going to drop the magazine, pull back the slide, check the chamber, and do this in a redundant fashion that really looks like I'm suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, it is truly redundant. And then I'll hand it to Brett, and if Brett knows anything about guns, he will do the same thing, having just seen me do it. And if he hands it back to me, again, I will do the same thing, even though there may be no ammunition around, right? So it really is crazy at the level of our explicit knowledge of the situation, and yet absolutely necessary to do. And it's not merely, it runs very deep. I mean, that whole time you're careful not to point the barrel of the gun at anything you would be afraid to shoot. And when people fail to live this way around guns, they, with some unnerving frequency, actually shoot themselves or people close to them by accident. So it is really the only proper hedge against just the odds of being in proximity to loaded weapons. And yet, if someone in the middle of this operation came up to us and said, actually there's a casino that just opened across the street that will take your bets about whether or not guns are loaded. Would you like to bet $1 million as to whether or not this gun is loaded? Well, of course, I would bet those $1 million every time that it's not loaded because I know it's not loaded. Right? So there's a literal truth and a metaphorical truth, otherwise known as a very useful fiction, which in this case is actually more useful than the truth, right? But the only way I can understand its utility is, and even utter the phrase metaphorical truth in a way that's comprehensible, is in the context of distinguishing it from literal truth. Yeah, go ahead.
This is fascinating, Sam, actually. This is I think, next phase of...
I'm worried by how excited you are. No.
Well, so I have a little story that might be helpful about that, and so you can tell me what you think about. You can think about this. Okay, so one of the things that I've been reconsidering since we talked last night is the nature of our dispute about the relationship between facts and values, because I think I can make a case that what I've been trying to do, especially in my first book, was to ground values in facts. But I'm not doing it the same way that you are exactly. So I don't want to make that a point of contention. And I'll get to that in a moment. But with regards to this metaphorical truth, let me tell you something. You tell me what you think about this. So one of the things that's been observed by anthropologists worldwide is that human beings tend to make sacrifices. So I'm going to spend 2 minutes, 3 minutes, laying out a sacrificial story. And the reason I want to do it is because, see, what I think happened with regards to the origin of these profound stories is that people first started to behave in certain ways that had survival significance. And that was selected for as a consequence of the standard selection practices. And so that was instantiated in behavior. And then because we could observe ourselves, because we're self-conscious creatures, that we started to make representations of those patterns and dramatize them and then encapsulate them in stories. So it's a bottom-up so it would be sort of like chimpanzees or wolves become aware of their dominance hierarchy structures and the strategies that they use. So a wolf, for example, if two wolves are having a dominance dispute, the wolf that gives up first lays down and puts his neck open so the other wolf can tear it out, and then the other wolf doesn't. And you could say, well, it's as if a wolf is following a rule about not killing a weaker member of the pack. Of course, wolves don't have rules. They have behavioral patterns. But a self-conscious wolf would watch what the wolves were doing and then say, well, it's as if we're acting out the idea that each wolf in the pack has intrinsic value. And then that starts to be, and maybe the wolves would have a little story about the heroic forbearing wolf that doesn't tear out the neck of its opponents, and that's good wolf. Well, that's good wolf ethics, and so, but it's grounded in the actual behavior. Okay, so we'll put that aside for a second. Now, here's the sacrificial story. So human beings have made sacrifices. It seems to be a standard practice all around the world. And in the biblical narratives, they would often sacrifice something of value, like a valuable animal.
Well, like a child. Let's start.
Well, look. I'm not making light of this. I know that human sacrifice was a part of this.
Yeah, but that's again. So just to give you a crib on where my mind goes here is human sacrifice is as old a religious precept as we know about.
Yes.
It's a cultural universal. The other sacrifices are derivations from it. Circumcision is a surrogate for the far more barbaric act of human sacrifice. And, it answers every test you would put to it with respect to its archetypal significance, its compelling presence in stories across all cultures. But the horror is that it actually has taken place in all these cultures based on explicit beliefs in the presence of just
right. Well,
oppressive scientific ignorance.
Arthur Kessler used that as the argument for the essential insanity of humanity. Right?
But it's not just the insanity of humanity. It's the misapprehension of the causal structure of the cosmos. You don't know what controls the weather. Well, you don't know why people get sick. You think your neighbor is capable of casting magic spells on you. You're ignorant of everything, and you're trying to force some order on things. And so when you don't, in the absence of engineers, and you don't know why certain buildings fall down, you actually can agree with your neighbor that maybe you should bury your firstborn child into every post hole of this new building, which in fact took place. And it's the consequence of ignorance. And so that the problem is, if you're only going to talk about this purified notion of sacrifice.
But it's a very strange consequence of ignorance, Sam.
It's the notion that we're in relationship to invisible others that can mistreat us based on our not having offered enough.
We are.
But not precisely those others.
Well, but we're in relationship to the invisible others who will judge us in the future.
Okay, you're changing the noun in important ways.
I know, but I'm also trying to understand, and I'm not trying to argue against the horror of child sacrifice.
No, I would never imagine you would.
I know. But I'm also trying to.
But my work would be much easier if you did that.
Yes, and the work of journalists as well. Although they've tried that pretty much anyways.
That's right.
Right, that would even be worse than enforced monogamy, hypothetically.
No doubt.
Yes. So see, let's say that I'm trying to give the devil his due, and I'm trying to understand from an evolutionary perspective, like a cognitive behavioral evolutionary perspective, let's say, why that particular set of ideas would emerge, and in many places, perhaps autonomously, or once having emerged would spread like wildfire. It's like, because I'm not willing to only attribute it to ignorance. Now, we could attribute it to ignorance, no problem, man. But there's more going on there because it is a human universal. And like there's all sorts of things that happen in nature as a consequence of biological and evolutionary processes that don't work out well for our current state of moral intuition, let's say.
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things, because I've been thinking about this sacrificial motif for a very long time, and trying to figure out, well, what the hell's the idea here exactly? And so here's one way of thinking about it. If you give up something of value now, you can gain something of more value in the future. Okay, so let's think about that idea for a minute. So the first thing is, that's a hell of an idea.
Yeah,
that's delay of gratification.
Yeah, delayed gratification.
That's right. That's the discovery of the future as well. And so you might say, well, the notion of sacrifice is exactly the same thing as the discovery of the future. If we give up something we really value now, we can make a pact with the structure of existence itself such that better things will happen to us in the future. Now,
yes.
Okay, now what's weird about this, and it's hard to understand, is that it works. So when I talk to my students, for example, and I say, what did your parents sacrifice to send you to university? Many of them are children of first-generation immigrants. And so, like, man, they're on that story in a second, right? They know all sorts of things that their parents sacrificed. And they're delaying gratification in the present for a radically delayed return in the future. Now, you think, animals, generally speaking, they might act out the idea of delayed gratification as a consequence of running out their instincts, but they don't conceptualize it. It's not obvious that animals give up something they value right now in order to thrive in the future. There's an old story about how to catch a monkey, right? So you put a jar up with rocks in it, and you put little candies, and it's a narrow-necked jar. You put little candies on top of the rocks. You put a few candies in front of the jar. Then the monkey comes along and picks up the candies, puts his hand in the jar, grabs the candies, and can't get it out.
Yeah, I still don't know if this actually works on monkeys or if it's just a great story.
Well, I don't know. I don't know either. And then I've heard various claims. But the point is, you can go pick up the monkey. He won't let go of the candies. Now, perhaps he would. But the issue is that it's not obvious that animals will forego an immediate gratification for a future gratification. Now,
I don't think that's right, actually. And I actually want to hold.
Well, the question is, will they do it consciously? They might act it out. They act it out. That's not the issue.
It's very hard to know if it's conscious because they won't respond to the questionnaires. But
I know. And obviously, the line between acting it out and starting to consciously represent it is a tenuous one. But what looks to me like what happened is that after we observed that people who were capable of delaying gratification sacrificed things that they valued in order to obtain a future goal, and it worked, that we started to codify that as a representation and then started to act it out. And so the story, and you'd say, well, that produced strange variants, but there's a reason for that too, as far as I can say. So imagine this. Imagine that there's a rule of thumb. Sacrificing what you find valuable now will ensure certain benefits in the future. Well, then the question becomes, how good could those future benefits be? And so that might be heavenly, let's say, in the archetypal extreme. And what's the ultimate sacrifice that you have to perform? And then I would say, well, the child sacrifice fits into that category. And so it's as if those ideas were pushed to their radical extreme. And you could say, well, that's a pathological extreme. It's like, well, it is a pathological extreme, but I think we also have to understand that some of the things that we've learned as we've evolved towards our current state of wisdom, such as it is that they were learned in a very bloody and catastrophic way. They were learned with incredible difficulty. And delay of gratification was certainly one of those, because it's a hell of a thing to learn when you're in conditions of privation.
Okay, yeah, I think that the issue here for me is that you don't need a conception of, you don't need any kind of positive gloss on human sacrifice as a meme or as an archetype in order to form a coherent picture of the future that can motivate you. So delayed gratification is fully separable from a notion that it might ever be rational or good to sacrifice a child as an offering to an invisible other that doesn't
But
exist.
how do you know it's separable? Because that's the developmental history. As you said, the
so
sacrifices
even if
came first.
I think it is in fact historically separable, but let's just say it's not. Let's just say it's a matter of our origins. They're united. They're of a piece. It is the genetic fallacy to care about that origin. I mean, to say that that is the only path forward toward a notion of the future, given where we've come from, or that it's somehow necessary to venerate now, or that it's good that we took that path.
But we do venerate the idea of sacrifice now. But I would say that
But
what's happened
I would say we do it to the detriment of our moral intuitions in the religious context. So, for instance, I think that the notion that Christianity is actually a cult of human sacrifice. Christianity is not a religion that repudiates human sacrifice. Christianity is a religion that says, actually, no, human sacrifice is necessary, and there was only one that, in fact, was necessary and effective, and that's the sacrifice of Jesus. And I think that is, when you dig into the details, not only a morally uninteresting vision of our circumstance and how we can be redeemed, it's morally abhorrent, right? So I think there's better versions online.
Let me ask you a question about that. So, in the moral landscape, you lay out this pathway. There's the bad life, and there's the good life, right? And you described what they were. And the bad life is a variation of hellish circumstances, and the good life is a variant of hypothetically the life that we would like to lead. And your conception is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, your conception is that the proper pathway forward, so that would be the moral endeavor, is to move away from the bad and towards the good.
Yeah, insofar as we understand which way is up, yes.
Yes.
The basic claim is that we can be right or wrong with respect to our beliefs there.
True. Yeah. We don't necessarily know how to do that in an unerring manner, and we could subject that to approximation correction along the way, and we should, but we can outline the broad scheme, which is progress away from hell towards something that's positive. Yes. Okay, so I would say that there's an implicit claim in that you should sacrifice everything in you that isn't serving that to that. And I would say that that's essentially the same claim that's made in Christianity.
Well, again, that is I understand the impulse to up-level these barbaric, ignorance-derived beliefs, right, to something that is morally, that is interesting and palatable in the current context. And I understand you can do that. My concern there is you can do that with everything. I mean, you could do it with witchcraft. Why not do the exact same thing you're doing with religion to the history of witchcraft? Witchcraft is as well
modern
subscribed.
Witches would do that. So that's a perfectly valid criticism.
That should be of concern. I mean, there are reasons why we don't want to endorse modern witchcraft, right?
Look, absolutely. And so one of your
But I mean, I'm not talking. And modern witchcraft currently exists. I mean, you go to Africa, people are hunting albinos for their body parts because they believe in sympathetic magic, and kids get killed as witches. So this belief endures in certain pockets of humanity, and we're right to. I mean, I just think at a certain point you have to acknowledge that some ideas are not only wrong, but their effects are disastrous, or have been disastrous, or will likely be, even if good in certain circumstances, will likely be disastrous in the future. And then we shouldn't be hostage to these ancient memes. We shouldn't have to figure out how to make the most of the worst idea that anyone's ever had, which is maybe you should sacrifice your firstborn child to a being you've never seen.
Hold on, Sam. I want to hold your feet to the fire here a little bit. 2 points. One, interesting observation. When you presented the example, so on your podcast I had argued that believing that porcupines can throw their quills might protect you from a porcupine that might wheel around even though porcupines can't throw their quills. Your listener sent the better example, which was all guns are loaded. When you presented it, you didn't say all guns are loaded.
Well,
You said treat all guns as if they are loaded, which is, I think, the same reflex that you have faced with any metaphorical truth, which is that it can always be unpacked.
But actually, that's the way Jordan talks about believing in God as well.
Right, and actually, so this is, but then if we take something like, you say, all right, sacrifice of children is abhorrent. Let's say it is. And then you say, well, Christianity hasn't foregone the sacrifice of children. In fact, it's described one child who is sacrificed for everybody else. But arguably, that's an upgrade of some metaphorical truth that frees those who are adhering to this tradition from ever considering sacrificing a child. And what it does is it provides a motivational structure that may, in fact, have very positive outgrowths, though not literal, the idea that someone would have sacrificed their own child for the benefit of everybody else not to have to. That idea might engender a large amount of good work that would result, as Jordan is pointing out.
Let me just concede that the hardest case for me, I mean, which I did up top, just in defining, after you define metaphorical truth, and I use the gun example, there's certainly cases where the useful fiction is more useful than the truth. I would grant that, but I think those cases are few and far between. But handling guns is one of them. It's just not useful when the casino opens across the street and you can place $1 million bet, right? Then you want to have some purchase on the literal truth. So you want to be able to, and again, this is psychologically interesting because. And I keep coming back to the gun example because it's the one that is viscerally real to me. Like, if I have a real gun that I know to be unloaded, I still emotionally can't treat it as a harmless object. I can't point it at my child just for the fun of it because, that we're going to play cops and robbers now with a real gun, right? I have a superstitious attachment to always being safe with the gun, right?
Okay,
and it's important. It's important that get ingrained, and yet it is not strictly it's not irrational because it has good effects, but it's not actually in register with what I know to be true factually in each moment.
Right. So it's very low cost.
It's
very low cost.
It's very low cost. It's not dividing societies and causing people to go to war.
And if you were going to teach a child gun safety, you would want to encode this so that they would automatically know never to behave as if a gun is unloaded, because that's what gets you into trouble. As an adult, every gun owner recognizes the distinction between the metaphorical truth and the literal truth here. But I guess what I suspect is going on here is that your mechanism for dealing with the world involves unpacking all of these things. And I think it's highly productive, but it also means that you have a hard time understanding why anybody would do anything different. And that's the question, is just because we can track fully the difference between guns actually all being loaded and behaving as if all guns are loaded, right? That one, there's no leftover, there's no mystery there, right? But there may be many of these things for which there is some difficulty lining up the metaphorical truth with the literal truth, and operating according to the metaphorical truth might have advantages, which I think is what you're getting at.
So here's another situation, because we have to remember what kind of catastrophic past we emerged from and how much privation ruled the world prior to 1895, essentially. And certainly the farther back you go, the more bloody and horrible it was. I mean, how often do you think it was necessary, and this is not obviously something I'm in favor of, and this is also one of these situations where we get to play with ideas that we might not otherwise play with. How often do you think it was necessary for people in the past who had absolutely no access to birth control and who didn't have enough food to sacrifice a child for the survival of their family? I mean, God only knows, and that's, but that's worth thinking about. It's like, life is unbelievably cruel and difficult. And one of the problems that comes when you discover the future is that you might have to make the most painful of sacrifices. And lots of archaic people do this sort of thing. They do that with their elderly people. They do that with sick people. They do that with infants that they deem too fragile to survive. So part of child sacrifice, and I know the literature on child sacrifice reasonably well, part of child sacrifice seemed to emerge out of the observable necessity to leave someone behind so that everyone else didn't die. And we don't know how often that had to happen in the past. It might have had to happen a lot.
Right.
Now, obviously...
Although, just in the interest of kind of conceptual clarity here, human sacrifice is a larger horror than that. So you have, what was very common is the sacrificing of captives. So you take the Aztec sacrifices where you now have slaves, some of whom you're going to...
Yeah, the Aztecs sacrificed about 25,000 people a year.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, it's clearly a bloody mess. There's no doubt about that. But, one of the things that you see happening in the biblical narrative, which is extraordinarily interesting, is that you see echoes of child sacrifice at the beginning. But what happens is the sacrificial notion gets increasingly psychologized as the story progresses. So, you see that transition with Abraham and Isaac, where the child sacrifice is actually forbidden, although previously demanded by God. And then you also see it, as you already laid out, in the substitution of the circumcision for the idea of sacrifice itself.
Right.
And then what seems to happen, I'm trying to figure out how these ideas develop psychologically from their behavioral underpinnings, is that eventually it becomes psychologized completely. So you can say, well, we can conceptualize a sacrifice in the abstract, so my parents can sacrifice to send me to university without anything or anyone having to die. It transforms itself from something that's enacted out as a dramatic ritual into something that's a psychological reality. But all that blood and catastrophe along the way is part of the process by which the idea comes to emerge.
Right.
But
so what is the connection of all of this? Because yes, so there is this history, and I would argue we are busily trying to outgrow much of it, if not most of it, whether it's evolutionary history or just the cultural history.
We might be trying to transmute it so that it becomes, we can maintain, as you've suggested we do, we can maintain what's useful in the tradition and throw out everything that's pathological.
Yes, but we're constantly discovering a lack of fit between both what we perceive in ourselves as biological imperatives and the cultural legacies of just what mommy and daddy taught me was true, right? Which we have now every reason to believe might not be true. And we're trying to optimize our thoughts and institutions and relationships with one another for our current circumstance. And yet we have this legacy effect of certain books and certain ways of speaking have a completely different status. And they have this status because they may, in fact, it's imagined, not be the products of merely previous human minds, but they may be the products of omniscience. And this is where the respect accorded to religious tradition is totally unlike the respect we would accord to anything else. Mythology, literature, past science, past philosophy. I mean, people can read Plato and Aristotle for their entire lives without ever being fully captured by the kind of dogmatism that every religion demands that you be captured by if you're really going to be an adherent.
I would say that's actually an archetypal truth. The idea that the pathological tradition stands in the way of update. That's an archetypal truth. I mean, one of the reasons why in creation myths, one of the variants of a creation myth is that the hero has to slay a tyrannical giant in order to make the world out of his pieces. And it's a metaphorical restatement of the idea that a tradition can become hidebound, and when it becomes hidebound and too rigid, that it interferes with current adaptation. But the problem is, and this is, I think, this is something we really need to hash out. The problem that you're describing is the problem of a priori structure. Now, some of that's textual, but some of it isn't textual. Some of it resides in us as our psyche, insofar as we act.
The problem I'm describing here is that we have two categories of books in this case, right? We have those written by people like ourselves, just endlessly open for criticism and conjecture, and those written by invisible, omniscient entities.
But I would presume that if these religious systems weren't codified in books, if they were still just enacted or dramatized, you'd have the same objection. It's not the fact that they're in books that's relevant.
Well, no, but it is the dogmatism. It's the fact that we can't jettison the bad parts.
Okay, it's the dogmatism. Okay, so to me, that's the same as the problem of structure. Now, here's the problem, I think, with the way that your argument is laid out. And I'm not saying it's wrong. It seems to me that this is a place where it needs to be developed, because I see that the attempt that you make to derive the world of value from the world of facts as as justifiable given what it is that you're attempting to do, which in principle is to make the world a better place. But there's a massive gap in there. It's like, how do you do it? Because the objection that you place on my reasoning, let's say, which is, well, the problem with these texts is that there's an infinite number of interpretations, and which of them how can you determine which of those is canonically correct, is exactly and precisely the same criticism that can be levied against your attempt to extract a world of value from the domain of facts. It's the same problem.
Well, it's not an infinite number of interpretations in either case, but I allow
it's
for...
It's close enough to infinite so that...
Well, it might be, I mean, that's why the moral landscape for me is a landscape of peaks and valleys. And so, I'm totally open to the possibility, in fact, certainty, that there are different ways for similar minds, and certainly different ways for different minds, to be constellated so that they have equivalent but irreconcilable peaks on the landscape. So there's a lot of well-being over here, and there's a lot of well-being over here, and there's a valley in between. And so it's a kind of moral relativism. It's kind of like, this is great and this is great, but these are irreconcilable, right?
Well, I'd like to see that made more concrete, and I need to know how that fits in with your conception, because one of the claims that you make in the moral landscape is that the distinction between the bad life and the good life is not only... It's a factual distinction.
Yeah.
It's universally apprehensible and true. I think it's your fundamental axiomatic claim. And I don't see how that's commensurate with the position that you just put forward.
Well, so here's the position. And you can forget about morality as a concept for this. I mean, I think the starting point is deeper than morality. The starting point, and this is our starting point, all of us right now in the universe. The starting point is we are conscious, right? We have a circumstance that admits of qualitative experience. And again, this is true however we understand consciousness, whatever is actually happening. We could be living in a simulation. This could be a dream. You could be a brain in a vat. Consciousness could just be the product of neurochemistry, or we could have eternal souls running on somehow integrated with the brain. Whatever is true, something seems to be happening. And these seemings can be really, really bad or really, really good. We know each one of us in our lives have experienced this range of possibility. And yes, there are caveats here. There are hard and painful experiences that have a silver lining, right, that give you some other capacity, where you could say, well, that really sucked, but I'm a better person for it, right? And we can understand what it means to be a better person for it in terms, again, of this range of experience, which I'm calling, subsuming all of this, the positive end of this as well-being, which is to say that I'm a better person for it because now, having endured that ordeal, I am capable of much greater compassion, or I appreciate my life more. The cancer made me a better person. Now that I'm cured, I value each moment of life more than I ever did. All of these claims are intelligible within a context of an open-ended context of exploring this space of possible experience. So what I'm saying is forget about morality, forget about right and wrong and good and evil. What is undeniable is that what we have here is a navigation problem. We have a space of possible experience. And again, this is not just a human problem, this is a problem for any possible conscious mind. We have a space of possible experience in which we can navigate, and things can get excruciating and pointlessly horrible, where there are no silver linings, and this can happen individually in some episode of madness that never ends. If there really is a Christian hell to go to, well, then it's going to happen to me after I die, right? Given what I've said on this stage, and so it matters who's right. Obviously, if I knew that an eternity of fiery torment awaited somebody who didn't make the right noises about one faith or another, well, then it would only be rational to make those right noises, right? So it's my bet. I'm placing a bet on certain pictures of reality being wrong, but the reality is we're navigating in this space, and morality and ethics are the terms we use for how we think about our behavior affecting one another's experience. So if you're in a moral solitude, if you're on a desert island, or if you're alone in the universe, morality is not the issue you need to worry about, but well-being still is an ever-present issue. It's possible to suffer, and it's possible to experience bliss and perhaps something beyond that. And the horizon in both directions is something we'll never fully explore very likely. I mean, we don't know how good things can get, and we don't know how bad they can get, but that there's a spectrum here is undeniable. And I would say that my moral realism simply entails that we acknowledge that it's possible not to know what you're missing. It's possible to be living in a way where you are less happy than you could be and not to know why, right? And just not have the wisdom to make the changes. And that matters. If anything matters, that matters. And it matters to us individually, and it matters to us collectively. And that mattering subsumes everything we can intelligibly want in this domain of value. And so again, it's the cash value of any value claim is in the actual or potential change in consciousness for some conscious system somewhere, sometime. And that's my claim. And that's.
Can I try to get? I would like you each to clarify something. So it sounds to me, Sam, like you are hypothesizing that a rationalist approach will always beat a traditional metaphorical approach with respect to the generation of well-being.
Well, not always, but there's so many obvious downsides to the traditional sectarian dogmatic approach that we should want to get out of the religion business as fast as possible.
Okay, but as fast as possible, but do you mean that it has always been true that we should always have gotten away from it as fast as possible, or do you mean now we should get away from it as fast as possible, but there is a point somewhere in the past where it might have been true that actually the best, the richest path to well-being might have been encoded metaphorically?
Oh yeah, that's certainly possible. And in fact, you might even say it was likely based on the fact that we have all of these systems still around. Right?
Okay. So we still have the systems around in part because we still think in metaphor, and we actually can't help it because half of our brain is oriented towards metaphor. But
can I get you to clarify something now?
Yes.
Okay. So you have argued, and you've actually quite surprised me by doing so, you've argued that the dogmatism is a bug and not a feature. You've argued...
No, it's a bug and a feature.
Okay, it's a bug and a feature. Good. So,
yes.
But what I thought I heard you say was that the resistance to update was a problem, that effectively it was an obstacle.
Yeah, so is lack of resistance to update.
Right, okay,
There's
good.
problems everywhere, man.
Well, there's a tension. Okay.
There is a tension.
There's a tension.
There's a terrible tension.
Okay.
Right, well, look at it this way. Look at it this way. Most new ideas are stupid and dangerous.
Yeah. But most
some
old
of them
ideas are as well. I mean,
but some of them are vital, right? And so we're screwed both ways. It's like, well, if we stay locked in our current mode of apprehension, all hell's going to break loose. If we generate a whole bunch of new solutions, most of them are going to be wrong and we're going to die. And so what we need to do is, it's a Darwinian claim in some sense, is that despite the fact that most new ideas are stupid and dangerous, a subset of them are so vital that if we don't incorporate them, we're all going to perish. That's the bloody existential condition. And so now, and part of the issue here, and I think that this is, the problem is that, let's take the dogma idea. Okay, so there's the dogma incorporated in the books, but I'm going to throw away the books because the dogma was there before the books. And then the question is, where was the dogma? And the answer was, the dogma was in the cultural practices, and in the agreement that people made with regards to those cultural practices, but it was also part and parcel of the intrapsychic structure that enables us to perceive the world as such. Now, the problem is, and I think this is the central place where we need to flesh out these ideas, is that you cannot view the world without an a priori structure, and that a priori structure has a dogmatic element. And so you can't just say, well, let's get rid of the dogma, because you can't perceive the world without a structure.
It has an uninspected element. I mean, so if you're talking about just perceiving the world, yes, we have perceptual structure that allows for us to perceive the world, and we know that there are failure states, right? So we know, for instance, that we've evolved to perceive, in visual space, based on a literally neurological expectation that light sources will be from above, right? And so we know that we can produce visual illusions based on gaming that expectation, right? But that's not the same thing as a dogma subscribed to by some subset of humanity that is antithetical to another dogma subscribed to by another set of humanity that has nothing to do with underlying biology. That's something that's changeable.
It's not so obvious.
No, but it's changeable in real time based on just conversations like this. Like, we could have, I get emails from people who can point to the paragraph where they lost their faith, right? Where in reading Richard Dawkins or hearing a debate between me and some theologian, where it's just a collision against rationality, which is so useful in every other context, suddenly proves its utility in this context where they think, well, okay, clearly I know the Muslims are wrong about the status of the Quran. Let me take that spirit of criticism in the internal space of my own culture, and what moves? Well, a dogmatic attachment to Christianity has to move by that same standard.
Well,
and it's possible to do that, and that's not a matter of getting into the brain and changing your perceptual apparatus that has.
Well, the distinction between different levels of what would you call it? Structure-related processing in the brain and the relationship to the underlying biology isn't clear. And it isn't clear when that's biological and when it isn't. So, your comments about our a priori perceptual structures notwithstanding, there's no clear line between what constitutes an instantiated, accurate biological perception and something that shades more into a cultural presupposition. So it's a gray area. Now, here, let me ask you a question. So this is one of the things I've been thinking about. So this is designed to point out I'm not making the claim that the idea that we should ground values in facts is wrong. I'm not going to make that claim, although I think it's way more complicated than we've opened up so far. But I would say I think relatively easily demonstrate a situation in which you cannot find the value from the facts. So let's say you own an antique. Okay, it's valuable. And you think, I'm going to take this antique apart and I'm going to find out where the value is. Good luck, man.
Well, it's not valuable in that sense.
Wait a second. So we need to know, so that's right, it's not valuable in that sense, because the value of the antique is a social agreement about its position in a hierarchy. It has nothing to do with the material substrate of the antique.
For sure.
Yeah, but you can't, it's not just sure. It's that you've made the claim already that you can derive values from facts. It's like, then what are you willing to accept as a fact?
These are facts about, again, so there are facts about, the facts exist in intersubjective space, right? So if I tell you, well, this glass, this isn't just an ordinary glass, I know it looks just like that one, but this is the glass that Elton John drank from in his last concert here,
yeah,
right?
Right.
So, what do you want to pay me for it, right?
Right.
It could be that, you're just the biggest Elton John fan ever, and it's worth quite a lot to you. Now it's a kind of evident, it's not value intrinsic to the glass, but
right.
it is a...
Where's the value located?
Well, it's a measure in the change this provokes in your experience, right? Just the idea, we value ideas as much as anything else, and that's hence the mad work done by religion, right? Because these aren't facts on the ground. These are ideas that rule people's lives. People spend their whole life afraid of hell.
Okay,
right?
It seems to me that it's easier in some sense, rather than to relate the value of that. And I love the Elton John's glass example. I was going to use Elvis Presley's
guitar. It's here. I will tell it to you.
It's like, where in the guitar is the fact that it's Elvis Presley's guitar? Well, it's nowhere in the guitar. Well, what is it in? Where is it then? And the answer is, it's in the dominance hierarchy of values that's been socially constructed around the guitar. It's located in interpersonal space. And that location, so value is located in interpersonal space. And if you want to say, well, that's also a fact, it's like, okay, but we're starting to stretch
it's a fact
the
about the beliefs and desires and conscious states of all the people involved.
Okay,
right?
well,
that's the only place where it exists. That's the only place where the idea of Elvis's guitar can show up.
Okay, well, I'm trying to figure out then, you see, because what seems to me to be happening, at least in part, is that we can stretch the domain of what constitutes a fact so that the domain of facts starts to incorporate the domain of values. But we do that with doing some damage to the domain of facts.
No,
well, hang on. Don't just say no. This is really.
I'll say more.
This is really complicated because you see, part of what the postmodernists have done is that they've pushed away the domain of facts entirely, and they say, well, the only thing that the only thing that actually exists is this domain of intersubjective agreement. And they,
you and I are on the same page with respect to postmodernism.
Right, but you have to give the devil his due as well. They pointed out something, and what they pointed out is that it's not so easy to localize the structure that attributes to facts their value. It's not a simple thing.
Now, wait.
Yes.
You would surely agree that if we had Elvis Presley's guitar, that guitar would have a material impact on people. We could tell them, this is Elvis Presley's guitar. Some fraction of them would disbelieve it. Somebody might be able to establish it based on a picture or something like that. And the point is, it would have a value that would alter the behavior of people with respect to that object in a material way.
Yes, it would alter the behavior of the people.
So the value could be manifest in physical space.
Which part of it? The
we
behavior?
We could detect it. We could figure out what the value of this guitar is based on some intersection
Sure,
between...
we could take a behaviorist approach and we could see how much work people were willing to do to make contact with the guitar.
We can scan their brains and see what...
I'm not so sure we can do that.
Well, clearly the brain is involved.
Hypothetically we can do it, but practically we're not so good at it. Because the MRI data, generally speaking, is junk.
Well, we can table that.
That
will be a profoundly controversial statement in MRI circles.
Fair enough.
I don't think we need it. We
don't need it, but
we
know
let's go with the
that a market will
idea.
establish the value of the guitar.
The brain, as yet incompletely understood, is surely involved in the valuing of this object, right? And so if I tell you that this is, and again, we can take it out of intersubjective space because you could be in a value solitude with respect to any given object. So it could just be, you could have a sentimental attachment to your watch that's worth exactly $25 because that's what you paid for it, but this is the watch that, this is your first watch or whatever it is, and you wouldn't sell it for any amount of money.
Right.
That's a behavioral measure of how much you value it. And if I told you, sorry, I borrowed your watch and lost it, what the cascade of negative affect that I see on your face is correlated with something that's happening in your head, and the brain is involved, right? So totality of that picture
what you're basically stating,
is the
as far
value.
as I can tell, is that there'd be a socio-cultural agreement as to the value of whatever this entity is, and that would find its mirror in the brain. And that's a non-controversial statement because all socio-cultural phenomena that are experienced find their reflection in the brain. The fact that you can say that that's reflected in the brain, it's like,
right,
yes,
but the
problem
we continually run into with religion is that you have a domain of so-called sacred values where people who are otherwise rational cease to be rational actors. So this is the reason why Israel and the Israelis and the Palestinians can't negotiate as though their problems could be solved by a real estate transaction is because they have irrational and irreconcilable claims upon land and buildings.
Do you think they're any more irrational than the claim that glass is worth something more?
Well, no, it's like that. It's like that. But I'm saying.
But that's not irrational by your own definition. You just said that was actually constituted a fact.
Well, no, it's a fact about people, right? So there are. This is okay.
Okay.
Should be a little careful here because it gets confusing.
Yeah.
We can make objective claims about subjective experience, right? We use this word objective and subjective in different ways. We use it in epistemological ways and ontological ways. And
give me just 1 sec to make sure I'm on the same page as you.
Well, so I can illustrate by way of example. If I say that that's just your subjective opinion, right? I'm saying that this is an expression of your bias. This is true for you, but it's not true out in the world, right? That's one way I can use the subjective-objective distinction, and that's an epistemological way. Like you're ruled by bias. You're not thinking straight. I don't have to take your opinion seriously. That's subjective. I'm worried about objective facts. But people get confused. They think that objective facts only means the material world and what's really in this glass as a material object. No, we can be much more objective than that. We can make objective claims about the subjective experience of people like ourselves. I can make an infinite number of objective claims about the experience. This is the example I always use, but I just happen to love it. What was JFK thinking the moment he got shot? Right? Now that's it. We don't know, so we'll never get the data. right? So the truth or falseness of what I'm about to say can't be predicated on actually getting access to the data because he's not around and his brain's not around to scan. But you and I both know an infinite number of things he wasn't thinking about. We can make an objective claim about his subjectivity. I know he wasn't thinking, well, I hope Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris work it out on stage that night, right? And an infinite number of things like that. He was thinking something, he was experiencing something, but we don't know what it is. So when I'm talking about this domain of value, I'm saying that it exists in this landscape of actual and possible conscious experience for human beings and any other system like us that can experience this range of suffering and happiness.
Well, okay, so, and partly what I'm trying to do is to actually determine what that structure is.
Well, in our case, it's certainly connected to the evolved structure of our brain.
Yeah, but I want to go way deeper into the brain.
It's augmented by everything else we do.
I want to go way deeper into the idea than it's connected with brain states, because it's definitely connected with brain states. The question is, at least in part, how, and what does that mean? And I think that the neuroscience has progressed far enough so that we can do quite a good job of this. And so, but I want to return to one thing, and maybe I'll outline a little bit of this. And when you talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you said that was irrational. And so, look, fair enough. People have been locked with their hands around each other's necks there for 3,000 years. But there's a problem there. And the problem is that people are looking at the landscape from a contextualized perspective, right? It's not just a piece of land, it's their piece of land. It's like your house or maybe your favorite shirt. It's like, well, you say, well, I have a favorite shirt. It's like, well, there's nothing inherent in the shirt that makes it your favorite. No, it's a subjective judgment. It's like, well, then is that a fact? Well, yes, it's a fact. It's a fact about subjective judgment. It's okay. Well, the Israeli claim on the land and the Palestinian claim on the land is a subjective judgment that's a fact. Yeah, it's like, so how is it irrational?
Because it is the true analogy here, the complete analogy is rather like we're about to fight over Elton John's glass, and Elton John was never here, right?
Well,
so I'm not saying so. It clearly still matters to us in our misapprehension of our situation. We still really care, and these are objectively true claims about the level of at which we value things. And hence the impasse.
Well,
but it matters
I think that's counterproductive dismissive. Like you could say, well,
it's really not. When you look at the specific claims, it's really not.
Look, you took the contextual interpretation to its absolute extreme. You said, well, there's multiple reasons why different people who occupy the same piece of land are going to feel about it in different ways.
Sure.
Okay,
most of those reasons are amenable to some kind of rational compromise.
Well,
I mean, there's actually there's studies on this. I mean, there's studies done by people who I disagree with.
When you say the word rational in that context, you're using it as a black box that contains the concept, proper way of thinking about it. It's like it's not so obvious in most situations what the rational approach is.
Well,
otherwise, life would be very, very simple.
I have an obvious one here, and that's that whatever the Christians and the Muslims and the Jews think they're getting from their attachment to their dogmatic and irreconcilable religious worldviews can be gotten just as well by a deeper understanding of our universal and non-culturally bound capacity for ethical experience, spiritual experience, community building, and we can touch that space.
What's that grounded in?
We can touch that space it's almost like the status quo it's almost like you're content to live in a world, or at least you're content not to judge too harshly a world where fans of rival soccer teams or baseball teams regularly kill one another over their fandom, right? Like what if that were the status quo? It's like it's been this way for thousands of years. There must be a reason for it.
Look,
people really like sports.
I'm not trying to justify the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
No, but
saying that
we
casual
shouldn't be too
attempts
quick to judge the sanctity of their differences of opinion.
Okay, but wait a minute, Sam. You made a claim. Like your claim was that if the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims would just stop their stupidity and adopt this universal ethic, then everything would be okay. It's like, okay, what's the basis for the universal ethic? Like, that's such...
That's a
you have this
no one's
universal
going,
ethic. It's
no
like,
one's
what is
going
it?
in search of that. The truth is, I mean, that's an interesting problem for philosophers and for scientists. That's not actually where the rubber meets the road for people living their lives well. I mean, this is analogous to me.
Sure
like
it is. It's associated in your book with the difference between the bad and the good life.
I really care about all of this, and my job as a philosopher, as a moral philosopher in that case, is to make the best case I can for these ideas. But the truth is, I mean, it is analogous to when you get into a debate with a Christian fundamentalist in the States. Very often, this person will pretend to care about cosmology or evolution as though it's the most important thing in the world, as though you can't get out of bed in the morning and figure out how to treat your friends and family well unless you figure out what happened before the Big Bang, right? No one really lives their lives that way, and yet we have convinced ourselves that this is a sensible way of talking about the conflict between religion and science.
So hold on. I think you have arrived at the core of your conflict right here, and I actually hear you both loud and clear. Your point is that if the people faced with the question were to, start with a fresh sheet of paper, look at the Middle East, they could arrive at a compromise that they as individuals might find put them way ahead and is more profitable than the situation that they are continually finding themselves in.
Yeah.
And that might be the case. On the other hand, the reason that they don't is that historically those who have been outcompeted by those who haven't. So the point is, the universe and the fact that it refuses to solve that conflict is telling us that there is some reason that people who take that prospect seriously are not actually correct in some at least metaphorical way. So in other words, what is it to have a sentimental attachment to some piece of territory somewhere? That sounds completely irrational. On the other hand, that sentimental attachment may result in you continuing for 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years, whereas if you surrendered it because it was irrational, you might go extinct. Now, should you care that your lineage is going to go extinct? Maybe, arguably not. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine that what you're saying is so thoroughly grounded that it can justify causing people to alter their perspective on value in such a way that it might actually drive them extinct. It's not clear that that's a good
clearly,
thing.
I mean, secularism, we're talking about the fringe here. We're talking about, when you're talking about, in this case, the Israeli settlers and the Palestinian terrorists, right? Like we should all breathe a sigh of relief that kind of passion and attachment to land doesn't characterize most of humanity.
It does if you're trying to defend your house.
So, but that's
Can I
kind of a
turn
different
that
topic.
back on
Yes.
Jordan? Because I think this is where the crux of it is.
Well,
so if
yes.
we follow the idea that this is actually that the seemingly sentimental and irrational attachment to the piece of land is some sort of meta-rationality, which sounds like your perspective, then we are now confronted with the question of, all right, if it is an evolved kind of meta-rationality that is being manifest in stories that cause people to behave in ways that Sam sees as clearly irrational, then we are stuck with the naturalistic fallacy, which is to say, so for those who don't know, the naturalistic fallacy says that just because something is doesn't mean it ought, right? The fact that selection favors something doesn't make it good. When the Aztecs sacrifice their enemies, it is good for continuing Aztecness, but it may not be good in some absolute moral sense. So here's the question for you.
Yep.
You're arguing for, I think, an evolutionarily very viable explanation for religious belief and dogma, but aren't you stuck with the downside of it, where much of what is encoded in that way may actually be abhorrent morally and consciously?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
No doubt about it.
what do we do about
Well,
that?
this is exactly
Do you have
why.
a sorting algorithm?
Yes.
What is
I'm
it?
trying to get to it.
Okay.
Okay, so this is actually why I asked Sam this question. It wasn't an attack. It's like, okay, so look, people have these belief systems, Christian, Muslim, Jew, we'll say for that, and you're saying abandon those, let's say, and move towards this transcendent rationality. It's like, okay, two problems. it's not so easy to abandon a belief system because you end up in the morally relativist nihilist pit, and that's a problem.
One doesn't have to. And many people don't.
people tend to, and so it's a
Well,
very major problem.
It's just not. I mean,
They don't have to. Look,
wait.
Sam,
That's an empirical
right.
claim that we'd have to find out whether that's true.
Well,
but there's a lot of evidence against that.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of evidence for it too, but it's beside the point to some degree because that isn't something that I want to quibble about. Perhaps there are transitional paths, and sometimes people find a collapse of their faith actually freeing. It's certainly the case that many of the people who are happy about what you're doing have found exactly that in what you've been saying, and more power to you. And so I'm not willing to dispute that. But what you said was, okay, here's these belief systems that are ancient and complex, and we can step outside of them, and there's this transcendent rationality that we could all aspire to that would solve the problems. It's like, okay, what is it?
Well,
what is it exactly?
It is, at a minimum, to value all of the variables that conspire to make the one life we know we have.
Okay, you
worth
can't
living.
value all those variables.
Well, no, we're doing it right. We do it every day in how we organize
No, we
ourselves
don't,
in
because
society.
we apply an a priori framework to the variables to reduce them to a tiny subset that we can manage. And it's the nature of that a priori framework that we haven't been able to have a discussion about. We have an a priori framework that narrows our perception to almost nothing. It's built into us. It's partly socially constructed. It has a deep neurological substrate. And we actually understand how it emerges to a large degree. And the thing is that...
But I don't think that's actually our difference. I mean, so the a priori framework operates in many different spaces, which again, we can't necessarily analyze, but it makes it no less true. So if you put your hand on a hot stove, you will immediately feel a very good reason, in fact, an unarguably good reason to remove it, right? And it doesn't require moral philosophy to get you there. You don't need to inspect your a priori framework. You just have to feel, holy shit, this is the worst thing I've ever felt, right? And there's so many moments like that in life that we dimly understand.
What if you're trying to rescue your child from a fire?
Well, exactly. Then you have some other goal, right?
Yes,
that
you
is going to cause you to brave that suffering, right?
Yes.
But again, trying to rescue your child from a fire is pretty close to as the hot stove in not needing to be analyzed, right? The imperative to rescue it becomes harder when you have to rescue someone else's child from a fire, and you're worried about orphaning your child who's standing next to you on the sidewalk, right? Then we get into the domain of moral philosophy, and then you can say, well, how much do each of us owe the children of other people, right? How much should I risk my life and risk orphaning my child to rescue your child? That's when things get interesting in a philosophy seminar, and that's where people begin to hesitate. People begin to, we are biased toward protecting ourselves, protecting our kin, protecting our friends, and only then do we begin to extend the circle. And again, but this is not a mystery where we want to go here. We want to extend the circle more and more and build institutions and societies that implement our best selves at our best moments more and more. It makes it more effortless to be good in the world. We want good incentives.
Can we take your example seriously here for a second?
Yeah.
All right, so you are built to be more likely to rescue your own child than someone else's child from a fire. We in society might like for the minimum number of children to die in fires as possible, which gets you to sideline that consideration in favor of, is there a child who's faced with a fire who I might rescue? Religions do exactly this restructuring of values because they say something like, actually, your goodness in risking your own life to save that other child from a fire is observed and it is calculated, and you will be rewarded for it in some way.
That's one possible benefit of some religions, right?
Good.
And again, so you put that on the balance, but I have a lot to put on the other side of the balance.
Sure you do.
Right?
I know you've got
how it's going to swing.
never-ending list.
Look,
right.
I want to.
Well, which that's what I'm trying to point out to Jordan here, which he actually acknowledges, which is that he's got a big stack of good things that come from this heuristic, but he's also acknowledging.
But this is actually this is our core disagreement here, which is however the balance is going to swing. The difference between us here is that I think we read the utility of anything, but in this case, religious thinking, as evidence of, you read it as evidence of something, perhaps, literally true.
Inevitability. Depends on what you mean by literal.
Yeah, so and I view that as a kind of version of either the genetic or naturalistic fallacy, that it's just like, whether that's it's useful now here for us, it doesn't argue that it's the best way of getting those good things. I mean, my argument here is that religion gives people bad reasons to be good where good reasons are available.
Okay,
right?
so
and that's a problem, right?
Right.
And because good reasons scale better than bad reasons, and I think we can even if you take the case where religion is clearly useful in a life-saving, utterly benign way, in virtually all of those cases, I think I can get you there by some other way without the downside, or if not, that's just one of those cases where, yes, the fiction was more useful than any possible truth.
How do you distinguish a religious system from an a priori perceptual structure?
Well, if you can convert to it or away from it in a single conversation, I would say if it doesn't go very deep.
Well, you're only, I would say that for much of that, you're only converting at a very superficial level.
Well, no.
You're converting at the level of conscious apprehension, and most of your cognition is done through unconscious processing.
Well,
so it's superficial.
It's just a fact about us that most of people's religious attachment is born of having it drummed into them by their parents. Right? But the truth is...
Well, no, their parents and their parents' parents and their parents'
yes,
parents'
exactly.
parents.
But if we did the same thing with Batman and Spider-Man, it would have the same effect. Right? Like if you relentlessly told children, right? I mean, I've got two little girls who are dressed up like Batgirl right now. They love Batgirl. There's nothing. I don't have to do anything to make them more enthusiastic about superheroes apart from just showing them the pictures of superheroes, right? If I told them, in addition to look how fun this is to dress up like Batgirl, in addition, you're going to burn in hell for eternity if you lose your emotional attachment to Batgirl, even for a minute, right? Well, then it's going to be Batgirl for the rest of their lives. Especially if the entire culture is doing likewise. And again, this is...
Well, as Brett pointed out already, a bad tool is better than no tool at all. And if Batgirl is the closest approximation to a divine figure that you can conjure up, it beats the hell out of none at all. And if Batgirl didn't partake of certain archetypal structures, no one would give a damn about Batgirl.
Okay, I'm
so Spider-Man and Batman
I'm gonna spare
play
you.
Play a role in the culture.
All right.
Because, look,
Hold
it's
on.
not accidental. It's not accidental that superhero stories have a structure. And to say that, well, Batman and Spider-Man are obvious fictions and we could use them as moral exemplars, which we do.
You're taking the wrong end. You're taking the wrong end of this. I'm not minimizing the power of stories. Right? I'm saying we can understand their power without recourse to believing things we shouldn't believe now in the 21st century.
I still need an answer to the question about what it is that's this transcendental rational structure without an a priori dogma, because I don't see it.
Well, it's not. Well, again, we touched on this a little bit last night in that I freely admitted that in every domain of human inquiry, no matter how, the most hard-headed, so mathematics, logic, physics, at some point we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. At some point we make a move that is not self-justifying and is not justified by any other move that's more rudimentary.
Right, that's a statement of faith. That thing
that's a callow use of the term faith.
No,
it's not the same kind of faith.
It's a precise definition of an axiomatic statement of faith.
My faith that 2 + 2 makes 4.
That's not faith.
Well, no, it is. No, it's my intuition that this is a valid and replicable and generalizable principle, right?
No, that's not faith either. Your statement that that's a useful claim is a statement of faith, but neither of those two were statements of faith.
No, they're statements of
fact.
intuition. No, these are intuitions. They're intuitions that can run afoul of other discoveries and other intuitions, as you know, which.
Well, if mathematical facts are intuitions, then what are we doing with facts?
We've arrived at the point where we have to decide.
This is super important, though.
Super important. Okay.
Okay, we don't lose this.
Okay. Yeah.
For 2,000 years, people had been studying geometry and had a very well worked out set of mathematical intuitions with respect to Euclidean space, flat geometry. And then some brilliant guy, Riemann might have been the first, said, well, actually, you can curve space. I can bend this triangle, and all of a sudden it has more than 180 degrees, right? That's an intuition that people tuned up pretty quickly, but all of humanity was blind to it for the longest time, right? These are, what I mean by intuition is, it's the thing you're using to understand something that you are not in a position to analyze.
I understand that.
But that's not faith of the sort which is, listen, I know the Bible was dictated by the creator of the universe. I know Jesus was his son. I know he rose from the dead. I know he'll be coming back, and 1,000 other propositional claims
if it's a statement of faith
highly
and it's
implausible.
valuable, if it's a statement of faith and it's in the value domain, how is it derivable from fact?
Okay, so we've arrived at the point where we have to decide whether to go to Q&A or to continue the discussion. While you all are thinking about that, I would like to level a challenge to each of you, and then I will poll the audience and see what they think about Q&A. Okay, so Jordan is arguing to you that you cannot ground the values that would undergird the modality of increasing well-being in anything factual. And you are arguing in response that...
Not without an intermediary structure.
Let me just argue in response.
Hold on a second.
Not without an intermediary structure.
What I've heard you argue is something that I agree with, which is that you can ground many things in a nearly objective observation of the universe, but it doesn't say anything about the value part of the equation. And in fact, I think, having thought about the question from an evolutionary point of view, that in order to do what you're talking about, to increase well-being, you are going to have to accept that that is going to leave you with an arbitrary grounding. There is no absolute grounding for it, and you're going to have to just simply accept that it's going to make you arbitrary, that you are in fact going to have to do inconsistent things like decide to honor the love of a mother for her child and dishonor the love of country that causes one population to gas another population. That's inconsistent, and that we need to embrace that kind of inconsistency.
I mean, it's just a different, I don't think that we even have the grounding problem. I think it's a pseudo problem.
But you just said you needed to put your staff in somewhere.
We have a navigation, so the way it's grounded is the acknowledgement that what we have is, I mean, it's analogous to what people do with the notion of meaning in life. Like, what's the meaning of life? How do you find meaning in life? Or what's the purpose of life? These are bad questions. These are questions that, when you pose them, they seem to demand, they suggest a space in which an answer must be put, but it's just...
But you put an answer there. You said that people should work towards the good.
Yes, there's a different way of framing it, which is, what we have here is an opportunity. It's not a matter of meaning, it's not a matter of purpose, and it's not a matter of grounding. It's a matter of, we are in a circumstance where we have consciousness and its contents in every moment. And all of this is, the lights are on, and they're on for reasons that we dimly understand, right? They're reasons that are biological in our case, but perhaps at bottom they're just based on information processing, and that they're platform independent. And then we would build machines for whom the light is actually on, or not, right? It remains to be seen whether we can actually build in our computers conscious minds that can thrive or suffer, right? And that the difference matters. But we're in this circumstance where we are trying to understand how consciousness and its states arises. But one thing that is undeniable is that the lights are on, and being on, they reveal a spectrum of experience that which has one end that the worse it gets, the more compelling it is to move away from it.
That's meaning. That's meaning right
yes,
there.
Okay, so and all of our meaning talk and value talk relates to navigating in this space. So there's one end of it where things get needlessly horrible without a silver lining, and there's another end where it gets better and better and non-zero sum, and all boats are rising with the same tide, and the Israelis and the Palestinians...
That's the landscape of evil and good.
Yeah,
so
okay, so
fine.
What do you do? That's why, so these are compelling ways to talk about this space of navigation.
What do you do when you accept your space of navigation and there's a conflict between well-being for the living population of Earth versus well-being over the maximum populations that could possibly live into the future? When there's a big conflict between how much well-being we are going to feel now versus how much well-being future human beings will get to feel.
Yeah, well, those are legitimate ethical problems, which I think we often live in the space where we know there's a right answer that we are too selfish to fulfill or too short-sighted to fulfill. Like, so I know there are things I do every day that not only will other people as yet unborn wish I hadn't done, I might wake up tomorrow wishing I hadn't done those things, right? So like I'm a bad friend to my future self in some respect, to say nothing of the rest of humanity. So we can have failures we can have weakness of will, we can have failures that we can just be wrong about certain things, but it's nowhere written that it's easy to be a good person, right?
But in that case, it's not even clear what good means.
Well,
no,
but I think,
it is clear. I'm saying
Brad,
even
I
in
think
those
I can
cases where
address
we
that.
know the answer, it might be hard to be motivated by that knowledge, and that because we're not a unity, right? I mean, part of what wisdom is morally is an ability to live integrated enough with your own, better self. The advice you would give to a friend. I mean, this just falls right out of your work as well. It's like live as though, but basically treat yourself the way you would treat. I think this is your line. So someone you're responsible for, or there's someone, a friend of yours, right? If you can do that, you're already ahead of who most people are most of the time. But there's no reason to say that because it's difficult, or because sometimes we're looking through a glass darkly and can't figure out what the answer is, the answer doesn't exist, or there is no right one.
Okay. Now let me try with you. So Jordan, you have argued for an evolved framework of religious belief in which there are elements that are morally defensible that will be carried through time. There are elements that are morally reprehensible that will be carried through time by virtue of the fact that they are effective. And you have argued that these things, because they have withstood the test of time, have some kind of value, which is not necessarily something that we should honor, but some large fraction of it must be. Mm-hmm. But that would seem to suggest that the degree to which these belief structures has value is contingent on the degree to which the environment in which we attempt to deploy these structures matches the environment in which they evolve.
Absolutely.
Now, I would argue that no population of humans has lived farther from its ancestral environment than we do.
Yeah, I think that's a fallacy.
You think so?
Yeah.
Because
well, it is and it isn't. And look, I think that's an absolutely valid point. Okay, so this gets esoteric relatively rapidly, but the question is, let's say at the highest levels of adaptation, we're adapted to the things that last the longest periods of time. Okay, those are the most permanent things. Now the question is, what are those most permanent things? And one answer would be the fundamental material substrate of the world. And that's true. I'm going to leave that be. Like, we're evolved to deal with gravity, okay? But there are other elements that are higher order abstractions in some sense that are also apparently hyper-real. So, for example, there's a problem that we have a bifurcated brain. The question is, well, why do we have a bifurcated brain? And the answer seems, and not just us, animals too, and the answer seems to be, well, there's two necessary ways of looking at the world, and they have to be in conflict to some degree in order to work properly. The right hemisphere mode and the left hemisphere mode. The right hemisphere mode is a lot more metaphorical than the left hemisphere mode. The right hemisphere is the hemisphere that seems to deal with exceptions to the rule. And it seems to deal with exceptions to the rule by treating them, by aggregating them, and then trying to recognize patterns that unite them as a corrective to the totalitarian system in some sense that the left hemisphere imposes. You could say that the right and the left are adapted for something like explored territory for the left and unexplored territory for the right. I've characterized that as order versus chaos. And I think the religious landscape is good versus evil, to Sam's point that we should strive for a good life, on a landscape of chaos versus order. And I think that landscape is permanent. Now, I know we've moved from our African ancestral homeland, but this underlying abstraction. This underlying reality is so profound that it maintains its validity across all sets of potential environmental transformations.
Well, okay.
Okay, can I just jump in here? Because here's why, just to seize on one piece you put in play there, here's why good and evil can't be permanent in the usual sense, certainly not in the Christian or Judeo-Christian sense. One is the Judeo-Christian notion of good and evil doesn't even map on to Eastern religion.
Sam, you made a good evil versus evil claim in the moral landscape.
No, but it's also in an Eastern context, in a Buddhist or Hindu context, the evil isn't really evil, it's just ignorance. Now, you might dispute that. You might say, well, that's not really, they haven't met a sufficiently evil person if they could think that. But the reality is that there are billions of people who have a different rubric under which they look at these things.
Sam, you can't make that case.
But let me add another piece here,
We need to ask them.
Okay.
Whether they want.
You guys need to vote.
Do you guys want this conversation to continue, or do you want Q&A to begin? I don't know which one you're cheering for.
Give them a pause and ask about Q&A.
First group is the group that wants this conversation to continue. All right.
Okay. Well,
and now, the group that would prefer Q&A.
Okay. Well,
it was the former.
What's disturbing is that many of the same people were clapping. that proves what Jordan was just saying about the two hemispheres of the human brain.
And metaphorical beliefs,
so look, I mean, it seems to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you made an absolute moral claim in the moral landscape, and that's what grounds your argument.
Okay,
the absolute moral
let's
claim
just take this evil piece, because it'll be interesting if it's not totally on point.
Okay.
The reason why evil is susceptible to total deflation is, if you agree with me, evil is a category of human misbehavior, human intention, that we don't understand significantly at the level of the brain. But if we did understand it totally at the level of the brain, then every evil person we had in the dock at trial would be just like Charles Whitman with his brain tumor after he shot up everyone at the University of Texas, right? So like he's the prototypically evil mass murderer, but he's complaining about this change that overcame his personality, and he thinks it would be a good idea that if after the cops kill me, you autopsy my brain, because I don't know why I'm doing any of this, right? And lo and behold, he had a glioblastoma pressing on his amygdala, and all of a sudden it made sense of his behavior in a way that a full understanding of psychopathy or every other variant of human evil would make sense of it in a way that would be deflationary ethically.
Okay.
And then you would look at someone like Saddam Hussein, or the worst evil person you could imagine, and you would say, well, he's actually unlucky. There but for the grace of biology go I. Because if I had that brain, if I had those genes, if I had those influences that gave me those synapses, I would be just like him. Now, if you think there's some other element that gives us free will, and now then you and I are disagreeing, then that's a factual claim that's at variance with mine. But if we are just on some level malfunctioning biological systems when we're being evil, then a complete understanding of evil would cancel that category.
Can you define evil so we know what you're talking about?
Well, take just the worst people who have sadistically victimized the most people, and those are the evilest people we can name.
So wait a second. So when you say, I think this is actually really important, because I think actual evil of that kind is pretty darn rare, and there's a lot of badness that emerges from a kind of
the most troubling thing
rationality.
are all the good people doing evil because they're ruled by bad ideas. I mean, that I think is more consequential than actual evil people.
We introduced a whole set of other things here in the last little round about free will and evil. But
I just want to make it clear why I went there. So you were saying this is I forgot the word you used, inevitable or ineluctable, or it's permanent. The implication is that this category is permanent, and I'm saying that I don't think evil in that sense is a permanent category for us. It awaits more information and insight.
Okay, we're going to distinguish for a minute good versus evil and good versus bad, just for the sake of conceptual clarity. In the moral landscape, you make a fundamental axiomatic claim. looks like a moral claim. Maybe it's a claim of fact. And the claim is there are bad lives and good lives.
Sure.
And the claim you make is that that's universally true.
Well, it's true for the requisite minds.
Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, doesn't matter.
Okay, but evil. So yes, I'm not telling you that you should purge the word evil from your vocabulary. I use the word all the time, and I think it's useful. It's a motivating word. I'm just saying that we can understand this continuum of good and bad, or positive and negative, in ways that don't use certainly don't use the Judeo-Christian framework for valuing these things. Because if you take the Buddhist framework and map it onto this continuum, you don't get good and evil. You get essentially wisdom and ignorance. Evil is ignorance of all the well-being you and others would experience if you behaved another way. Right? That's the Buddha's game, or even within Hinduism. And again, this connects to your love of stories. You take the Hindu text, the Ramayana, which is just a foundation. It's doing the work that the Bible is doing for Jews and Christians. That the worst guy in the Ramayana, the 10-headed demon Ravana, the prototypically evil person, is at bottom really not a bad guy. He's a great sage who is just in a bad mood, essentially. Right? I mean, he was obscured by ignorance. And so it is in the Buddhist canon. The Buddha meets a serial killer who is wearing a garland of human fingers around his neck, named Angulimala, but he was just one conversation away from being fully enlightened, right? I mean, he was like, it's a different picture of possibility. I'm not saying one is right or wrong. Let's be agnostic about that. I'm challenging your claim that there's something so prescient and useful and durable about the Judeo-Christian framework.
I wasn't making that claim in this
we're stuck with it for all time.
Well, I wasn't making that claim. I was making the claim that in the moral landscape, you laid out a distinction between the bad life and the good life. Forget about good and evil. The bad life and the good life, hell and heaven, the bad life and the good life, and that distinction was not only factual but universal. And so since you made that axiomatic,
given the right mind. So we could imagine a mind. I mean, this is an example.
Okay, universal in a right mind.
But we could create circumstances that seem perverse to us that we would recoil from. You could create a universe of perfectly matched sadists and masochists, say, right? So you have the people who are real sadists, who in our world would be terrible actors, but in their world, they're surrounded by people who want to be mistreated. Now, again,
if you're a real sadist, you never mistreat a masochist when he asks you to.
Okay, well, these are... But granted, I'm not...
Sorry,
I'm not sure the human categories even exist.
Couldn't resist.
But undoubtedly we could create something like an artificial intelligence that could be paired this way, and that would be weird. But in my framework, it is a conceivable space of equivalent well-being, and it's not matched at all to our space, right? But if in fact we could inspect the conscious minds of all parties participating in that, it is not obviously absurd, in my view, to say that they are just as happy as we are in this conversation. In fact, some moments in this conversation, I would say that they might be happier.
No, it's been good. It's been good. So let me ask you a question here about well-being, because this is something I've wanted to ask you about, but we never seem to get to. Okay. So you think that we should maximize well-being, and that's part of your proposition, which I don't entirely disagree with, by the way, that we should ground our value structures in facts. But there's a black box problem there, like I think the black box problem about the a priori structure that we use to extract the facts of the world out. And the black box problem is, if we could measure well-being, it's like, yeah, that's a big problem, Sam. Like, we have measures of well-being, and they're terrible. Yeah. Like they are.
No. I'm agreeing. I don't think. But it's not a problem for my thesis. We don't have measures for anything we care about, really.
Yeah, but I mean, if your thesis is that if we had the measures of well-being that were appropriate, we could use them in a positive way, and the response is, but we don't have those measures, it's like, then what do we do?
Oh, no, we have measures. I mean, this conversation is a measure. I don't like that. That's a measure. Right? You step on my toe and I say, ow. That's a measure. Don't do that again.
But that's not a measure of your well-being. It might be a measure of your trait neuroticism.
Well, it's a measure of.
But I mean that.
These are non-points.
No, but I mean this.
Yeah.
I mean this technically.
Yeah.
If you look at the well-being measures that we have,
Yes,
they degenerate into measures of neuroticism.
No,
that's all they are.
But we don't have measures of certainty, of belief, of compassion, of joy, any of these conscious states. We have neural correlates of some of them, but we don't have. There's no
then how do
helmet
we use,
I can put on you.
How do we use
hold on,
facts about them to orient ourselves in the world then?
Because we're doing that. We're doing this all the time.
You've got an instantaneous measure, though. You've got an instantaneous measure of well-being. We can all check with ourselves, see how we feel.
And it's possible to be wrong about that.
Right.
Always,
Sure.
always
Okay.
wrong
Sure.
about it.
But it degrades as you get away from the individual's ability to check internally. On the
Well,
other
even
hand,
the internal thing isn't reliable
It's
because
not
lots of times
reliable
you're
and-
happy when you're doing things that
well,
are terrible
sure, and
for
you could
yourself.
take a drug that would make you feel very good and would cause you to take apart your own life because it would
You mean like
remove-
cocaine, for
right,
example?
it would destroy the motivational structure that gets you to do stuff of value that you're
Right, so we
justified-
can't use emotion, moment-to-moment emotion, as an indicator
Right,
of
the
well-being.
instantaneous is not good. But you have a parallel problem. It looks to me like the exact mirror image, which is that you've got an integrative, long-term measure of well-being instantiated in an evolutionary belief system, but it's coming apart because we are living in circumstances that are less well mirrored. The present does not mirror the past, and therefore these truths, which you believe are timeless, are degrading rapidly.
That's part of that's exactly right, yes.
Okay, so what Sam is arguing is that the tools to pivot in order to improve our way of interacting, those are not the tools of long-standing tradition. Those are the tools of rational engagement.
Respect for that process is part of the long-standing tradition.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, but that's a big truth, man.
I agree.
That's a major league truth.
I
And
agree.
in fact, I would say the fundamental tradition, the most fundamental tradition of the West, says that respect for the process that updates moral judgment is the highest of all possible values. And that's also built into the tradition, strangely enough.
I agree it's built into the tradition, but I would argue that it is very likely to be compartmentalized. In other words, I was a little bit struck when you said that, what did you say about scaling? You said that
good reasons scale and bad reasons don't.
Isn't that the opposite of the truth?
No,
If you're calling these stories that give prescriptions for how to behave bad ideas, the point is those stories propagate very easily. So if we want to talk about the gun and whether it is loaded, the idea that the gun is definitely loaded, that scales really easily, right? You can pass that along in one sentence.
And the
people can get it.
the consequences
On the
of
other
being
hand,
wrong about a loaded gun also scale, right? So,
No.
Well, they
If
should.
you want to talk to people about very small possibilities of very dire things happening, they trip over it. It's a hard thing to get. It's almost impossible for children to get it. So the point is, the one thing does scale, a story that says, yeah, every gun is loaded. It's a false story, but that one definitely scales.
Yeah.
The statistical reality of guns and the fact that they may indeed be unloaded, but you don't want to play around with the remote possibility that one day you'll get it wrong, right? That doesn't scale because it requires you to have experience with stuff that is not common.
Right. Well, so there are two things here. One, you bring up an ancillary but very important point, which is that moral progress here is often the result of moving from our story-driven, protagonist-driven intuitions to something far more quantified, right? So I mean, this is a classic, moral study done by Paul Slovic, who I'm sure you are aware of, where you tell people about one needy little girl in Africa, and you give her a name and show her picture, and what you elicit is the maximum altruistic, compassionate response from subjects. You go to another group of subjects, you tell them about the same little girl, give her the same name, but also tell them about her needy little brother, right, who has the same need, and their response diminishes, right? Just the addition of a single person diminishes the response, and this is a moral fallacy that we're all living out every day, because if you care about this one little girl, you should care at least as much about the fate of her and her brother. And when you add statistics to it...
No, you shouldn't, because
Well,
you'll exhaust yourself. No, you shouldn't.
This is a bug, not a feature.
Man, you'll exhaust yourself in the attempt.
No, because we need...
What, are you going to care for 100 people with the same intensity that you care for one?
This is what this software flaw gets us. It gets us people who will watch for hours a day with effortless and tear-stained compassion the saga of the little girl who fell down the well, but who will blithely turn the channel when they're hearing about a genocide that is raging and hundreds of thousands have already died.
Sam,
right?
listen, guys.
This is something we have to correct for this. I'm not talking about person. No, but you're misunderstanding me to great effect here. That I'm not saying that you should personally be overwhelmed by the death toll every day. I'm not saying that it's functional for you and I to each personally get up each morning and just drink deep of the full horror of all the bad luck that is spread.
No, maybe it is, but maybe we can't handle it.
But as societies, we need, when you're talking about how we spend our money, how we apportion foreign aid, the kinds of wars we fight or don't fight, the kinds of then we have to correct for what is in fact a moral illusion, which is we know that if we tell we tell one compelling story about a little girl, right, we could go to war over that, right, whereas we won't be motivated by a genocide. That's the kind of thing that moves whole societies now. And if you add to it the bogus religious sanctities, if we burned a Quran on this stage tonight, the rest of our lives would be spent in hiding, right? Because of how motivated people would be to address that pseudo problem, right? That's the world we're living in, and civilization, insofar as we have a purchase on it, is a matter of correcting for those errors. And
but
religion, for the most part, not across the board, but for the most part, is standing in the way of those course corrections.
Well, okay, there is a tremendous amount to unpack in that. I mean, and like in some sense a surprising amount. It's like, well, we're wired to feel intense empathy for individuals who are close to us, and we can be told stories in a manner that makes that system manifest itself. And everyone and their dog thinks that that's a wonderful thing, and we call that empathy, right? And empathy has a narrow domain of utility, as it turns out, because maybe if you were all who you should be, you'd be weeping constantly for the catastrophic fate of sentient beings on the earth, but you can't handle it, you know what I mean? It's that you can barely handle your own suffering, and maybe you can handle a bit of the suffering of your family, and more power to you if you could rectify that, and if you were better human beings, maybe you could expand that outwards. But the fact that our empathy doesn't scale up to the level of genocide with the same intensity that we treat instances of individual suffering isn't an indication that we're irrational. It's just an indication that we're limited.
Well,
That's not true.
I
think this is an indication of exactly the problem of our evolved structures not matching the present. Because the point is...
Well, they do match because we take care of our families.
No, but they don't match because if you encountered the starving girl, that's some sort of it's a crude measure of suffering in your local environment. Were you in the past? Now that you can encounter this girl on the television, it's not clear what it should mean to you.
Right.
Right? You can't calibrate
it might
how
mean
many...
get your act together.
Right, and so the point is, your indifference to a genocide, which is an abstraction, right, is altered should you see pictures of the bodies, for example. You shouldn't actually feel differently about the genocide in the abstract case versus the case that you're looking at the bodies, and the fact that we have access to photorealistic representations of these things.
But it's worse than that. This is why it's actually irrational, because I can show you the case where you care at level 10 about the little girl named Leela, and you care at level 8 about the little girl named Leela and her brother named Janti, right? And you care at level 4 if I've added a few more kids, but the little girl named Leela, who you ostensibly care about, is there in each one of these, right? So it
Yeah, but
is
your
irrational.
resources are diminished as
No,
a
but like
consequence
you
of
have
the multiplication of the suffering.
You have $10 to give away every month to help struggling humanity, and you tell me you'll give 10 to Leela this month, and then I catch you in another moment, and I say, well, you know, it's Leela and her brother, so it's like if you only can give 10. I understand, but you know, the problem is actually worse than I suspected. And you say, well, actually, I'm just going to give 8, right? It's not coherent with how much you cared about Leela in the first place.
We do know quite well that the heuristics that we use to orient ourselves in the world can be placed into frameworks where they produce contradictory outcomes. But that doesn't mean that the heuristics themselves are deeply flawed. It's a problem with the work of people like Kahneman and Tversky.
Yeah,
is they take perfectly valid heuristics
for them. We need to correct for them because they're producing a reliable result that we recognize.
Yeah, but no, you can put them in a
non-functional.
situation where they produce a counterproductive response, but that doesn't mean that generally speaking in most situations they don't produce a useful outcome, because the question is, why in the hell would have they evolved if they didn't produce a useful outcome most of the time?
They evolved to live with 150 people with whom we're related and to be terrified of the people in the next valley who may want to kill and eat us.
Yes,
right?
and
that's our ancient circumstance,
right.
which doesn't map onto a common humanity of 7 billion people trying to figure out how to get to Mars without killing each other.
Well, it does map onto it sometimes, unfortunately, because there are many times when we still face the same kind of threats. In fact, it maps onto
this is the hierarchy that we're trying to climb
Sam.
here.
You wouldn't be concerned about the fundamentalist terror of Islam if you weren't driven by those essentially tribal considerations.
No,
and I'm not suggesting that it's wrong.
It doesn't require, a mere identification with humanity, it can ground not wanting to be murdered by people who are identified with a subset of humanity, right? Like I don't need to be part of a smaller tribe to care that people will murder me over burning a Quran, right? It's clearly counterproductive that we live in a society where some objects are held with such totemic attachment for irrational reasons by many, many millions of people, where that you should be sympathetic with this. Our free speech is actually canceled on this point, right? I mean,
Yes.
We literally can't produce cartoons.
Look,
there are scholarly works about the cartoon crisis that don't show the cartoons.
We have no argument whatsoever
Okay.
between us about the lack of utility of certain
You don't have to be
totalitarian
identified
presuppositions.
as a Christian or a Jew to push back against that. You just have to be a human being that sees the dysfunction of a smaller kind of provincialism.
Well, the thing that I'm struggling with is that I still can't understand in what your ethos is grounded. Because you claim like a transcendental rationalism, but you won't identify the structures that produce it. It's a black box. And when I try to push you on the absolute nature of your ethical claim, which is that the bad life is worse than the good life, and that we should, in fact, universally work towards the good life, it doesn't seem to me that you'll accept the proposition that that's a universal claim.
No, it is. Well, should is irrelevant here. It's just the fact that there is the possibility of moving in this space. If you move in the wrong direction, if you move far enough, you'll like it less and less.
Well, why is should irrelevant?
Given the minds you have, right?
Well, I thought
what
that
if you had to accept moving in the wrong direction and experiencing less and less well-being in order
to get to a better place?
Maybe even just to survive. Suppose a population has to endure a generation and a half of misery in order to persist for another 100
ethically,
years.
that's a perfectly intelligible circumstance that people have had to face, and it's on my moral landscape, it's analogous to, we might be at one local maximum or some high point, but we're moving down a slope to get to yet some higher place, right? So some things may only be possible if we made some painful and net unpleasant sacrifice to get there.
That's for sure.
Yes, and so that can be rationally apprehended. There can be an argument for that. It could be we all have to go on a diet. Otherwise, we're going to die of this problem, right? We all have to stop eating whatever it is, wheat, right? It's a hard sacrifice for people who have to stop it, as you know. If that were just true, well, then there'd be an argument for it. There'd be evidence that would convince us. We would stop. We would feel the pain, and we would get whatever benefit that was on the other side of that sacrifice. But again, you don't have to. It's the utility. Again, to bring it back to stories. which is, as you know, not my emphasis, but it is yours. The utility of stories is not something I'm arguing against. I mean, there's no question that certain stories are incredibly compelling, and in our conversation with one another, the moment you begin to frame something in terms of a story, people become much more interested, right? Like if 90% of what we said together tonight were framed, each point we were making as a matter of philosophy or science were framed in, well, actually, yesterday I was walking down the street and I met this guy, who's a terrifying looking guy, and all of a sudden people become much more interested, right? And then that's not an accident. And that says something deep about us that we could understand in evolutionary terms, and we might in fact want to creatively leverage to be better people, and to have better conversations.
Definitely.
Yes. So
that's what I think.
There's nothing that I say in opposition to religious dogmatism and religious sectarianism that discounts that reality. And that's a psychological reality. It's a cultural reality, and I'm not against making the most of it. My basic claim, however, is that we never need to believe that one of our books may not have a human origin in order to do that effectively. You can be just as compelled by the example of somebody like Jesus or some more modern person who strikes you as a moral hero and deeply wise, without believing anything on insufficient evidence. And as you alluded to, purely fictional stories about superheroes can have immense effect on us, and that's something we could understand and also leverage. But again, that takes us out of the religion business, and that's all I've been arguing for.
So do you really believe that that the belief in the supernatural aspect of these stories never alters the calculus of what people should do? That the divine nature of a story about Jesus doesn't motivate people to do something that they might not have the courage to do otherwise? The belief that they might end up in heaven because their good work is going to be observed doesn't alter their behavior?
Well, yeah, I know it alters their behavior, but rather often for the bad.
Well,
no, I mean, this is what worries me about. I think there's a profound net negative that we are paying the price for every day by believing in paradise, right? A belief that this life, it probably doesn't matter very much at all, because we get what we really want after we die is, forget about the evidentiary basis for that belief. It's ruinous for prioritizing what we should be prioritizing in this life. And
I agree with that, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's interesting.
Yep. So, let me ask you this. I hear from you what might be a kind of confirmation bias, where I hear that, we've got a mixed bag. You've got supernatural claims. These supernatural claims, we all agree, have effects on the way people actually behave. And you're quite focused on the negative, and you tend to discount the positive, which might be an artifact of the fact that we're talking about the present, and therefore maybe something that's not well matched to these stories, or it might be from the idea that you have the sense that there is actually a bias, that these belief structures do and have always produced more harm than good.
And also my sense that the positive can be had without those structures. So if you're talking about the contemplative experience, like, is it possible to wake up tomorrow morning feeling like Meister Eckhart, right? Feeling like you're just inseparable from the pure capital B being that is consciousness, right? And there's no separate self there, right? A self-transcending union with everything you can perceive, right? I think that can be had without any kind of religious dogmatism. That's just a matter of paying close enough attention to the nature of consciousness. So the contemplative life is one baby in the bathwater we can save. The ethical life is another baby we can save. You don't have to presuppose anything on insufficient evidence to argue about what is right and wrong and good and evil in the 21st century. And that's,
so is it fair to call that a hypothesis, that not just for some people, but for everyone, the level of well-being can be enhanced through rational interaction with the questions that dictate what we do? Is that a hypothesis?
Well, that's a hypothesis. The one additional fact that makes that more or less moot is that on certain points, even if we felt that really believing the fiction was advantageous to people, depending on which fiction you're talking about, there's too much evidence against it. You can't decide to believe something for which you have no evidence simply because of the good effects, the good experience it will give you, or you imagine it will give you. I mean, that's why Pascal's wager never made any sense. I mean, you can't say, the only way you can believe something to be true, really true, not just metaphorically true, is to believe that if it weren't true, you wouldn't believe it. That you stand in some relationship to its truth such that that is the reason why you believe it. Now, you can't be telling yourself, I have no evidence for this thing, but I know life would be better if I believed it to be true, and so therefore I really believe it's true.
You don't think people do that all the time?
I don't think they do. I think they do things much more like we're talking, the metaphorical truth we're talking about. We act as if things are true without forming any strong propositional claim, and that's fine. That's fine. That has its own utility. I mean,
you don't think this is basically, we all suspend disbelief when we go and watch a movie, and we sort of entitle the movie maker to set the ground rules of the space, and if it's Harry Potter, then there are magical things that can happen, and if it's some other story, maybe there aren't. So we all have a mechanism whereby we know we can suspend disbelief, and it's interesting to me that you seem not to imagine that people are doing that with respect to metaphysical beliefs that have implications for what the right actions that they should take are. Why wouldn't it be the case that same sort of mechanism would apply?
Well, it does apply, but there are people who are clearly doing much more than that. So I'm not, if that's all people were doing under the aegis of religion, I wouldn't spend much time worrying about religion. To some degree, that's what people do, as you say, going into caring about things that at bottom we really shouldn't care about. So the World Cup is on right now, and we literally billions of people care down to their toes what happens to this little ball as it traverses a lawn, right? And if it goes into the net, it really matters. And if it fails to, it really matters. And
it always matters if we hit the target, Sam.
But this is something we have manufactured to care about, right?
It's something that speaks to us unbelievably.
It's quite literally a game. This is a game that people are playing, but some people take it taking it further than seems truly rational is part of the fun. But the people who can't turn that off.
It's a metaphor. Soccer's a metaphor.
Yeah, but there are people who the fullback who kicks an own goal and then goes back to his South American village and gets murdered, right? He's surrounded by people who are taking the game too seriously.
Yeah,
right?
okay, I agree.
Yeah, and so my problem with religion is that so much of the time we're meeting those people, and we're not criticizing those people. We have no place to stand to criticize those people because we're so attached to the game.
Fair enough. Look, why don't we do this? Why don't we each take 3 minutes to sum up?
So I think, we are there. We are at the end of time. So why don't you each take 3 minutes, sum up, and then we'll call it good.
Yep.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Sam went last. You want to go first here?
Okay. So there's lots of things about which Sam and I agree, but the devil's in the details, of course. I'm very sympathetic to his claim that we need to ground our ethical systems in something solid and demonstrable. My problem is I'm not sure how to do that. I don't believe that you can derive a value structure from your experience of the observable facts. There's too many facts. You need a structure to interpret them, and there isn't very much of you. And so part of the way that that's addressed neurologically is that you have an inbuilt structure. It's deep, it's partly biological, it's partly an emergent consequence of your socialization. And you view the world of facts through that structure, and it's a structure of value. Now, that structure of value may be derived from the world of facts over the evolutionary time frame, but it's not derived from the world of facts over the time frame that you inhabit, and it can't be. So the problem I have with our discussion so far isn't really any of Sam's fundamental ethical claims, because I do believe there's a distinction between the hellish life and the heavenly life, say, the life that everyone would agree was absolutely not worth living, and the life we could imagine as good. And I do believe that we should be moving from one to the other. The question is exactly how is it that we make the decisions that will guide us along that way? And I don't believe we can make them without that a priori structure. In fact, I think the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that we can't, and I mean also the scientific evidence. And I would like to go further into the devil that's in those details. And so that's my situation at the moment.
Well, part of these conversations, and now you and I've had, I think, we've done 2 podcasts, and this is our second live event. And thank you for doing this, by the way. This is
Hey, it's my pleasure, man.
It's an honor to do this. It's an honor to do this, and it comes with risks for both of us to do this. I mean, as I think you can sense, we don't have precisely the same audiences. All of you are sort of rooting for one or the other of us to some degree.
Or for the spirit of truth.
And yes. But clearly the conversation is the point, right? This is not, though this conversation had the character at many moments of a debate, I don't think either of us view it as a debate in the trivial sense. It's not about point scoring. It's about making sense in a way that's consequential, because we're talking about issues of great consequence. And you obviously care about these things, and it matters whether we converge on the most important questions in human life. And as you know, I'm worried that religion doesn't give us the tools we need to converge. What does give us the tools is a truly open-ended conversation, and then you simply have to look honestly at the obstacles toward any conversation being open-ended. And religion presents those first and most readily. It is the idea that certain things have been decided for all time, and there's no future evidence or argument that is admissible on those points. Now, that is clearly bad everywhere in science. It's bad everywhere in how we renegotiate our proximity to one another in society. New laws and new ideas are born all the time about how to structure institutions and social relationships, because new things happen. I mean, we didn't have an internet, and then we did. So our old laws and our old expectations of human communication simply don't work in the presence of this new thing, right? So we have to figure out, again, it's a navigation problem. And what I'm perpetually in contest with, even in conversations like this, is the sense that the rules need to change just a little bit for this class of books. I mean, literally, this side of the bookstore, right? There's like any other part of the bookstore, well then there's no barrier to honest conversation. But you move over here, you got this shelf of books, there you have to hold your tongue, right? There we can't pick and choose. We can't say that, while we can say that Shakespeare wrote some fantastic plays, the best plays ever written, and some are actually not that good, right? We can't say that about God, right? We have to find some tortured way to make the most of his diabolical utterances, right? That's the thing we have to outgrow. And so what I'm continually in tension with you is the degree to which your style of talking about religion and the power of narrative and the meaning derived from it elides that point and seems to let people off the hook on that very point. And that's where we need to hold the line, in my view. We need to sure. that it has to be clear to us at this moment in history that no one has the right to their religious sectarianism, really. I mean, up to the point, clearly, that there's a World Cup version of it that is benign. But once it gets taken past that point, we have to figure out how to pull the brakes, and that becomes a real problem if you are going to dignify the foundational claims of these faiths, claims like revelation and paradise and blasphemy and apostasy. I mean, these are the things that you come up against, and I think conversations like this are incredibly important because we need to convince the better part of humanity that it's possible to live the best life possible without recourse to divisive nonsense. And where we draw the line between divisive nonsense and reasoned and necessary discourse is what we're dickering over, and I think it's important that we continue. So, yeah.
Hold on. So, in closing, let me say, first of all, I'm tremendously honored that you asked me to moderate these debates.
Fantastic. Thank you.
It was a truly remarkable experience. As for what was accomplished, I think it was a tremendous amount. I saw both of you move. I saw both of you exhibit tremendous generosity of spirit towards the other, and I think this has exceeded my expectations of what might have been possible in these discussions by quite a bit. And that also, I will say, has a lot to do with the fact that for reasons I think none of us can explain, a huge amount of people, a huge population seems to care about these issues because they matter a great deal. So anyway, I think this has been a very successful exercise, and I think you can both justly be quite proud of what you've done.
Yeah.
All right, let's give a huge round of applause for our speakers tonight.
Pleasure. You continue. Well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So the problem I have with our discussion so far isn't really any of Sam's fundamental ethical claims, because I do believe there's a distinction between the hellish life and the heavenly life, say, the life that everyone would agree was absolutely not worth living and the life we could imagine as good. And I do believe that we should be moving from one to the other. The question is exactly how is it that we make the decisions that will guide us along that way? And I don't believe we can make them without that a priori structure. In fact, I think the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that we can't, and I mean also the scientific evidence. And I would like to go further into the devil that's in those details. And so that's my situation at the moment.
Well, part of these conversations, and now you and I've had, I think, we've done 2 podcasts, and this is our second live event. And thank you for doing this, by the way. It's
my pleasure, man.
It's an honor to do this. It's an honor to do this, and it comes with risks for both of us to do this. I mean, as I think you can sense, we don't have precisely the same audiences. All of you are sort of rooting for one or the other of us to some degree.
For the spirit of truth.
And yes. But clearly the conversation is the point, right? This is not, though this conversation had the character at many moments of a debate, I don't think either of us view it as a debate in the trivial sense. It's not about point scoring. It's about making sense in a way that's consequential, because we're talking about issues of great consequence. And you obviously care about these things, and it matters whether we converge on the most important questions in human life. And as you know, I'm worried that religion doesn't give us the tools we need to converge. What does give us the tools is a truly open-ended conversation, and then you simply have to look honestly at the obstacles toward any conversation being open-ended. And religion presents those first and most readily. It is the idea that certain things have been decided for all time, and there's no future evidence or argument that is admissible on those points. Now, that is clearly bad everywhere in science. It's bad everywhere in how we renegotiate our proximity to one another in society. New laws and new ideas are born all the time about how to structure institutions and social relationships, because new things happen. I mean, we didn't have an internet, and then we did. So our old laws and our old expectations of human communication simply don't work in the presence of this new thing, right? So we have to figure out, again, it's a navigation problem. And what I'm perpetually in contest with, even in conversations like this, is the sense that the rules need to change just a little bit for this class of books. I mean, literally, this side of the bookstore, right? There's like any other part of the bookstore, well then, there's no barrier to honest conversation. But you move over here, you got this shelf of books, there you have to hold your tongue. Right there, we can't pick and choose. We can't say that, while we can say that Shakespeare wrote some fantastic plays, the best plays ever written, and some are actually not that good, right? We can't say that about God, right? We have to find some tortured way to make the most of his diabolical utterances, right? That's the thing we have to outgrow. And so what I'm continually in tension with you is the degree to which your style of talking about religion and the power of narrative and the meaning derived from it elides that point and seems to let people off the hook on that very point. And that's where we need to hold the line, in my view. We need to sure. That it has to be clear to us at this moment in history that no one has the right to their religious sectarianism, really. I mean, up to the point, clearly, that there's a World Cup version of it that is benign. But once it gets taken past that point, we have to figure out how to pull the brakes, and that becomes a real problem if you are going to dignify the foundational claims of these faiths, claims like revelation and paradise and blasphemy and apostasy. I mean, these are the things that you come up against, and I think conversations like this are incredibly important because we need to convince the better part of humanity that it's possible to live the best life possible without recourse to divisive nonsense. And where we draw the line between divisive nonsense and reasoned and necessary discourse is what we're dickering over, and I think it's important that we continue. So, yeah.
Hold on. So, in closing, let me say, first of all, I'm tremendously honored that you asked me to moderate these debates.
Fantastic. Thank you.
It was a truly remarkable experience. As for what was accomplished, I think it was a tremendous amount. I saw both of you move. I saw both of you exhibit tremendous generosity of spirit towards the other, and I think this has exceeded my expectations of what might have been possible in these discussions by quite a bit. And that also, I will say, has a lot to do with the fact that for reasons I think none of us can explain, a huge amount of people, a huge population seems to care about these issues because they matter a great deal. So anyway, I think this has been a very successful exercise, and I think you can both justly be quite proud of what you've done.
All right, let's give a huge round of applause for our speakers tonight.
Pleasure. You continue. Well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Successful exercise, and I think you can both justly be quite proud of what you've done.
All right, let's give a huge round of applause for our speakers tonight.
Pleasure. You continue. Well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.